want to say a couple of words by way of introduction. The Gera Rebbe is said to have commented about the invention of the locomotive, which was a great development in the industrialization of the Western world, and in its day transformed society as it had existed up until that time. And he made the following, I think, arch observation. He said, we can learn from a locomotive, from a train, that one hot carriage can pull 100 cold ones. And Rabbi Shafier is such a hot carriage. He has passion, he has drive. Even in our days in yeshiva, that was true. And as I said, he hasn't slowed down at all. On the contrary, he has picked up momentum and has carried in his wake not only like a locomotive, but even much more so as someone who inspires and has brought spiritual succor and nourishment to many followers, not only in his own community, but far, far afield as well. So I'm delighted that Rabbi Shafier, who has invented the Shmuz, which is a Shem Davar, one can see bumper stickers with the Shmuz on. I even once saw one here in England, actually. I don't know whether anybody else understood the meaning, but it has touched off, Rabbi Shafier has touched off a kind of process of personal growth and passion that he has shared with his followers. So I've spoken, I think, probably more than enough already, and I'm delighted to call on Rabbi Shafier to share with us some thoughts on our subject. He has written a book on the subject as well. Perhaps he'll tell you about it. And I know we have promoted the book to say that those who are attending the shiur, who have access to Kesher, are able to collect a book from Kesher as well afterwards. So, I mean, not afterwards tonight, but subsequently in the days to come while stocks last. So without further ado, over to you, Rabbi Shafier. Thank you again for joining us all the way from East Coast USA, and especially on the 4th of July, giving up the picnic, the barbecue, the fireworks, and all of that. All
fireworks might be here. Rabbi Simon, thank you very much. And it was a few years ago that we were in at least 8 or 9 years ago. No, did I get that right?
It may have even pushed into double digits, possibly.
Possibly. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for the introduction and welcome. I apologize first off for my accent. I speak Americanese. I don't speak English. And also, if you hear any loud bangs in the backyard over here, it is the 4th of July. There may be some fireworks. I take no responsibility. My apologies. But in any case, the concept I'd like to deal with this evening is the concept of marriage, the concept of relationships, and really what's needed for a successful relationship and ultimately for a successful marriage. And to do that, let me begin with a little context from the Chumash. The Chumash tells us that Avram Avinu lifts up his eyes and he sees 3 wayfarers on the horizon. He rushes out to them, bows down full face in the sand. He assumes that they are but Arabs lost, and he welcomes them into his area. He rushes out, prepares a full meal. He stands over them like a waiter as they eat. At a certain point, one of these 3 turn to Avram and say, Ayeh Sarah ishtecha, where is Sarah, your wife? Now, if you think about it, that's a little bit unusual. Why? Here the man welcomes you in, gives you food, gives you beverage, and then you start asking, where is your wife? And Rashi comments on this by saying, Malachei Ashoris saw you. These were not men, these were malachim, the highest level of angels, and they knew exactly where Sarah Imenu was. Why did they ask, Ayeh Sarah Ishtecha, where is Sarah your wife? Kedei lechavava be'enei baila, to make her more beloved in his eyes. Avram would answer, my wife is in the ohel, she's in the tent, she's a tznuah, she's modest, she's not in the limelight. She doesn't want all the fanfare. When Avram would say those words, he would somehow perceive a little bit more deeply that his wife was the type of woman that he greatly respected. It would cause him to love her more, to make her more beloved in his eyes. And that's how Rashi explains why the Malachim asked the question, so that Avram would answer. And if you think about that, that's rather difficult to understand. Why? Because we're not dealing with newlyweds over here. We're not dealing with a couple who are squabbling. We're not dealing with a couple that are fighting. As a matter of fact, I'll just share with you one simple observation. What is the single most difficult part of being married? If you'll ask anyone who's successfully married, and certainly one who's not, it's learning to be other-centered, learning to put someone else's needs, someone else's concerns before my own. If the world ends and begins in my 4 cubics, I am a difficult person to be married to. But here's the point. Avram Avinu is the most other-centered, most giving, most caring individual you could ever imagine. Sarah, his wife, is his equal. If you imagine 2 tzaddikim, 2 tremendously pious, righteous people who live their entire life to give, to share. If you'd imagine the marriage that they must have had, and if you'd like to know the marriage that they had, the Maharal tells us that in the course of history, there was never a bond, never a connection between husband and wife as there was between Avram and Sarah. So let's revisit the question. Why did the Malachim overstep their bounds, ask a question that might be inappropriate to make her more beloved in his eyes? They had a fantastic marriage. They had a great marriage. Why would they overstep their bounds to ask this question to make her more beloved? And if this question doesn't trouble you, let's follow the sequence of events a little bit further, and maybe you'll see another problem. One of the Malachim say, next year, this time, your wife will have a child, you'll have Yitzchak. The Torah tells us that Sarah is in the ohel, she's in the tent, she's listening from there, and she hears the prophecy that she's going to have a baby next year. But Tischak Sarah Bekirba, Sarah laughs inwardly saying, how could it be? How could it possibly be? My husband is old. Edna, I can't physically have children, and my husband is too old. How could it be? And she laughs inwardly. When Hashem complains to Avram, why did Sarah laugh? Hashem says to Avram, why did Sarah laugh saying that she's too old to have children? Now, if you follow the line, that's not what Sarah said. Sarah said, I physically can't have children, and my husband is too old. Yet when Hashem says back the story to Avram, Hashem says, why did Sarah say that she is too old to have children? That wasn't what she said. She said, Avram, our husband, is too old. And Rashi picks up on this point, and Rashi says, Shina kasav mipnei shalom, which is a polite way of saying Hashem lied. For shalom bayis, for peace, you're allowed to change the truth. And it's a polite way of saying that Hashem changed the truth. Instead of saying that Sarah said that you're too old, Hashem didn't want Avram to hear those words, so Hashem changed the words and said, Sarah said that she's too old. Our Rabbi, the Rishiva Zatzal, asked the following question on this Rashi, and that is, what do you mean that Hashem changed the words? What was Hashem afraid of? We're dealing with a couple who married 74 years, the greatest bond, the greatest connection. Let's assume for a minute that Avram heard Sarah said that he's too old. Do you think it would have cracked up? Do you think it would have been broken? They didn't live in a juvenile world. They didn't live in a world where youth was respected. Quite the opposite. Avram Avinu was incredibly accomplished. Every year of his life was another tremendous accomplishment, another tremendous diamond in his crown. And here he's at the age of 99, at the height of his strength. By the way, he lived another 75 years, so he wasn't a decrepit old man. Let's assume that Hashem told over, Sarah said, you're too old. What would have happened? Why did Hashem have to change Mibnei Shalom as if it would cause a disruption, cause a divorce, cause some kind of separation? And my Rebbe asked that question on his Rashi, and I'd like to see if we can understand these 2 points. Number one, why did the angels feel they had to make Sarah more beloved in Avram's eyes? Number two, why did Hashem change so that Avram shouldn't hear the words of criticism that his wife feels he's too old? And to understand the answer to this, let's take a step back and try to understand this institution called marriage. And to do that, let me share with you a medrash. The medrash tells us that Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta was once approached by a Roman matron, and this matron said, tell me, what does God do? Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta said, after God created the world, what he's busy doing now, he's meshadech shidduchim, he makes matches. The daughter of this one to this one, son of this one to this one, that's what Hashem does. This matron says to Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta, that is what Hashem does? What's the big deal about that? And says Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta, if you think it's easy, you should know it's as difficult as splitting the sea. Says this woman to Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta, that's not difficult at all. I could do it. I have 1,000 slaves. I can show you. I'm going to do it. And she takes her leave. That evening, she matches up 1,000 male slaves with 1,000 women slaves, and she makes 1,000 matches. She comes back the next day to her plantation, and she sees this one has a black eye, this one has a broken arm, this one's limping. What happened? Oh, that woman you gave me, that man you gave me. She comes running back to Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta. Toraschem emes, your Torah is true. Elokechem emes, everything you said is true. Says Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta, isn't that what I told you? If you think it's easy to make matches, it's as difficult as splitting the sea. Now, while this is a very interesting medrash, I believe it actually shares with us a very, very important concept. And that is that marriage is not so simple. A successful marriage is very, very far from simple. And if you'd like to understand why, I'll make it very clear. If you have a successful business, I'd like to give you some advice. If you need help, hire talent. If you need help in marketing, hire talent in that area. If you need help in accounting, hire that talent. You could hire any sort of help that you need for your business, but one thing, don't bring in a partner. Why? Because almost every partnership ends. It might be 5 years later, it might be 10 years later, but they all end, and it's usually in a very ugly way. Why? Because listen, I want to take the business this way, you want to take it that way, and invariably 5 years, 10 years, most businesses end, and the only thing worse than bringing in a partner is bringing in a family member as a partner, because then when the split happens, it's a lot messier. So here's the observation. If we're dealing with two men and asking them to share their 9 to 5, to do business together, it doesn't last more than 5 years, 10 years, 15 at the most. But when you bring a young man and a young woman together, you're not asking them to share their 9 to 5. You're asking them to mold their lives together from the time they get up in the morning till the time they go to sleep at night, how they raise their children, how they bring up their home, what type of vacations they go on, what type of culture, everything that they're going to do together. If she's late, it reflects badly on him. If he's sloppy, it reflects badly on her. They're molding together their lives. And if you think about it, not a single marriage should work. It's far too demanding and far too difficult to take two human beings who are so different, bring them together and ask them to live in love, peace, and harmony for 50 years. It should never work. But if you're not quite sure that it should be, in fact, difficult, let me share with you another important observation. Men and women are different, but not casually, not topically, not in incidental areas. Men and women are fundamentally, at the core of their essence, completely, radically different. And they behave differently, think differently, communicate differently, they have different interests, different desires. And I'd like to show you where it begins. Daniel Goleman, in his book Emotional Intelligence, writes about a study of public school children. They took a group of 3-year-old public school children, and they asked the boys the following question: please name your best friend. And here's what they found. Almost 50% of the boys named the girl as his best friend. Then they asked the girls the same question: please name your best friend. And about 50% of the girls named a boy as her best friend. Same group of children, when they reached the age of 5, they asked the boys to name their best friend. Only 20% of the boys named a girl as his best friend, and only about 20% of the girls named a boy as her best friend. Same group of children when they were 7 years old, not a single boy, zero, not a single boy named a girl as his best friend, and not a single girl named a boy as her best friend. Why is that? Because when children are young, 2, 3 years of age in the juvenile stage, they play together nicely, and they share interests, and they do well together. But as they get a little bit older, boys become boys and girls become girls. And boys are off playing rough and tumble games. Girls are off playing different kinds of games. They have different interests, different desires. By the time they're 7, they're in different worlds. And if you're not sure that I'm right, just go to a public school. Go to the schoolyard and watch very carefully during recess. The classes are all mixed. Lunch is mixed. But in the schoolyard, they're off playing different games. Why? Because the boys and the girls typically have very little to do one with the other. Now, here's the interesting observation. As boys and girls get older, those differences don't lessen. When they become 9, 10, 11, 12, those differences become far, far greater, and they begin entering totally different worlds. By the time a young man is ready to get married and a young woman is ready to get married, they're in totally different worlds, different interests, different desires, and different things they talk about, different things they spend their time with. So here's the observation. You take a young man brought up in his home with their way of doing things, with their approach to life and their ways. You take a young woman brought up in a different home with her family's approach, with their ways. You take these two very different people, put them together for a short courtship, say mazel tov, and you expect them to live together with peace and harmony for the next 50 years. If you think about it, not a single marriage should work. Every single one should fail miserably and within a short amount of time. However, Hashem wants marriages to succeed. And therefore Hashem created many tools for a couple to succeed at marriage. The first tool is something called infatuation. Infatuation is where the young man and the young woman get that glassy-eyed look in their eyes. Ooh. And you could see he's speaking differently, he's acting differently, she's speaking differently, she's acting differently. As a matter of fact, if you look at their behavior, they're totally different people. It's almost like a blend of mania, dimension, obsession. What's interesting to note is that psychologists now study the state, and the neurotransmitters, those chemicals in the brains, are greatly affected by the state of infatuation. Serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline. The change in the neurotransmitters is similar to cocaine use. The couple are high. And in that state, they begin their courtship. And I'd like to share with you one of the most interesting parts about that state of infatuation. Their shura sasecha, their wise intellect, their discerning understanding seems to be canceled. I'll share with you a very interesting example. When my wife and I were newly engaged, I heard her on the phone, and this conversation, she was on the phone with a friend, the conversation sounded something like this. Listen, I know no one's perfect. I know he can't be perfect, but I'm telling you, he's perfect. Now, I was standing there listening. I was not going to be the one to spoil her story, but I was sharing the understanding that she is in for a rude awakening. Here's the point. My wife is one of the sharpest people I know. And why did she have the sense that he's, believe me, after she got married, it was no longer, Baruch Hashem, we have a great marriage, but not perfect. Because in that state of infatuation, there's this glorious sense, the chemicals in your chest go off, the neurotransmitters flood your brain, and everything is viewed differently. That is one of the tools of bonding. The first tool of bonding is infatuation. It's when they each get that rosy colored look in their eyes, that glassy look. They look at each other. He's perfect. She's perfect. Her bad habits will never bother me. His sloppiness, I'll be able to live with it. And they begin their marriage or their relationship together. And I'd like to share with you a very interesting reality. 6 months, usually after the marriage, either he or she, and sometimes both, wake up one morning and say, oh my goodness, oh my gosh, oh my.
Rabbi Shafier, you're going to have to go backwards. You need to unmute. There was a little bit of a technical error. Sorry about that. I'm going to mute myself. Just unmute yourself.
Oh my, when did I mute?
You told us about your wonderful wife, and she's very bright. One of the most accomplished.
Oh, my wife. Okay. Wow, you missed all that good stuff. Okay.
No.
My wife is. Why don't mute? Let me just see if the wire is the problem. Sorry, folks.
No, it wasn't. It was something else. It was something technical. Okay. My apologies.
Okay. In any case, my wife still is one of the sharpest people I know. Why did she make that mistake? Because in that state of infatuation, there's this rosy picture of life. Everything's going to be wonderful. Everything's going to be great. And now here's what I call the first mistake that most couples make. It's about 6 months, maybe 8 months after the marriage when either he or she, and sometimes both, wake up and say the words, oh my goodness, I made the biggest mistake in my life. I married the wrong one. And it's true that they're making a mistake, but not about marrying the wrong one. You see, the infatuation wore off. Infatuation is that chemical that goes off in the brain, but it's a little bit like sulfur on the match. You strike the match and it's supposed to flame up, and then the wood is supposed to catch. Infatuation has a shelf life. It lasts 6 months, maybe a year, but then it evaporates and it's gone, never to be heard from again. And the very first mistake that many smart couples make is they assume, oh my goodness, infatuation's gone, I married the wrong one. They didn't marry the wrong one. Now it's time to work on the marriage. Now it's time to work on the real bond of love. And that's the key distinction. You see, infatuation is instant. It just happens. Love takes a lot of work. Infatuation is automatic. You don't even have to work it. It's there. Love takes a lot of work. And it's at that moment that the couple have to begin the difficult job of creating a true bond of love. And infatuation is not something that remains for any length of time, but even more than that. The bond of love in the marriage is not infatuation grown up. I've dealt with many, many successfully married couples who are not infatuated at all. And I've dealt with many, many infatuated couples who within a year or two of the marriage are fighting cats and dogs and literally can't stay in the same room. Love in the marriage is a lot more subtle, requires a lot more work, but it's not infatuation grown up. Now, with that being said, let me ask you the following question. What is the biggest cause of divorce today? If I would ask you a question, what is the biggest cause of divorce in our world today? So I'd imagine if I would ask that question, I'd probably get a string of answers, or either children, money, religion, maybe in-laws. I'd like to share with you that none of them are major contributors to divorce. As a matter of fact, issues in the marriage are never the problem. If you'd like to know the single cause of divorce in our world today, the single greatest cause is something called fighting. Fighting. Now you say, oh, Rabbi, come on, of course fighting. But isn't it the children and the in-laws and the religion that they're fighting? It's never the issues. It's how the couple deals with the issues. You see, the issues are just parts of life. Many, many couples have major differences between them, but have a beautiful marriage. Many couples have very little differences between them, but can't seem to get along. And I'd like to share with you exactly what I mean. 70% of successfully married couples have at least one irreconcilable difference. An irreconcilable difference means a difference that can't be reconciled. He has a successful business in Manhattan. She has allergies and needs to live in San Diego. Chicago doesn't cut it for either of them. He wants to bring up the kids in a Hasidic way. She wants Litvish. You can't send the kids to yeshiva with payas on one side. There is no reconciliation. 70% of successful marriages have at least one and maybe more than one irreconcilable difference. And yet somehow they're successfully married. Why? Because if there's a bond of love, if there's a connection, one day my way, one day your way, it's okay. As long as we're in this together, the issues never cause the problem. But what does cause the problem is the climate of the relationship. If the climate of the relationship is love, bonding, friendship, and we're in this together, then you manage to weather any storm. But the minute that love starts to wane, then every issue becomes a major issue. Fight you will, and rare it is that you're going to resolve those issues cleanly. And let me share with you quite how clearly this comes to play. John Gutman, who is a religious Jew, is one of the most famous marriage researchers in the world today. And he has a study. With 94% accuracy, he can determine whether a couple will divorce within 5 years. 94% accuracy, something that's unheard of. And he explains his system. He brings them into his lab and he sits them in 2 chairs and he measures everything, their body temperature, their heart rate, perspiration. He videotapes it and he asks them to talk about 3 topics. One is a neutral topic, another is something of family, and the third is what he calls a hot button topic, something that they typically argue about. And he watches very carefully. But you know what he's watching for? He's watching for contempt. Now, contempt is not hatred, not anger. It's sort of like the rolling of the eyes. They're like, he says if he sees one sign of contempt and doesn't see 5 positive signs opposite that, that couple is headed for deep, deep trouble. And why is that? Because at the core of the essence, what a marriage needs is that bond of love. There has to be respect. There has to be love. When there's love in the marriage, he's a good guy with a flaw, but it's okay. If the bond of love starts to weaken, he's a creep and a bum, and everything he did wrong, and anything he ever did right was for the wrong reason anyway. The minute that bond of love begins to wane, we are in big trouble. And my friends, I'd like to share with you, Hollywood got it 100% correct. Hollywood got it 100% right, except backwards. You see, in the world of Hollywood, we fall in love, so we get married. Then we fall out of love, we get unmarried. Love comes, love goes. Who can know, who can understand? I'd like to share with you the reason we marry is because I understand that Hashem designed this person to be the perfect fit for me. And in that decision-making process, love has nothing to do with it. However, if in your marriage there isn't a very powerful bond of love, if there isn't a vibrant connection, then you are going to be in serious trouble. You see, marriage is what I call the glue. The glue of marriage is the love in it, meaning to say the love, the bond, the connection, that's what keeps a couple together. And I believe that's exactly the answer for why Hashem changed. You see, it's true. Avram Avinu would not have been broken up had he heard that Sarah said he's an old man. He would have thought, ooh, she called me an old man. But it would have caused a slight, tiny little scratch in the relationship. On almost maybe an infinitesimal level, Avram would have felt, my wife doesn't respect me, she thinks I'm too old, I'm not capable, and it would have marred the finish to the slightest extent. And Hashem felt it was appropriate to change the words to lie because he didn't want to spoil the relationship. And the concept number one is shalom bayis, and the love between a husband and wife. That marriage, the relationship is holy. And it's something that Hashem will change, will lie for. But number two, let's look at what the Malachim did. The Malachim stepped out of their bounds. They said, where is Sarah? Why? Because they wanted to make her more beloved in his eyes. Because despite the fact that Avram and Sarah had the most magnificent marriage, despite the fact that they were 99.9% perfect in the marriage, there was more that could be gotten. And the angels wanted to ask that question so that Avram would have a greater appreciation, because every little essence of addition to that love, to that bond, to that connection is essential. And that's why they overstepped their bounds. They asked a question that might not have been appropriate because they felt it was that important to make her more beloved in his eyes. And my friends, this is what I call the essence of a successful marriage. You see, marriage has three pillars to it. Commitment is based on the fact that I know that God chose the right one for me. The love in the marriage is something that has to be worked on, has to be constantly developed, constantly kept intact. And the minute it starts waning, then as a couple, you're in deep trouble. Now, I get the phone calls all the time. I've dealt with literally hundreds and hundreds of couples in the past 10, 15, maybe 20 years. And many times it's quite typical. As a matter of fact, the reason why I call the book The 10 Really Dumb Mistakes That Very Smart Couples Make is because I see very smart couples making the same really dumb mistakes over and over and over. So here's the first one. Actually, the first one we mentioned. Here's the second one. I get a call and it sounds something like this. Rabbi, thank you for taking the call. I need to talk to you. Sure, what's up? It's my husband. Okay, what's the story? Well, I respect him. He's responsible. He's very good with the children. He earns a good living. He even learns Torah. He's a great guy. I said, so far it sounds pretty good. What's the problem? Well, the problem is I don't love him. I don't love him. So what do you do? What do you do when you get the phone call? I don't love my husband. So because I've been around the block a couple of times, I asked the question that I typically asked. I said, tell me, madam, last month, how many times did you and your husband go out? But go out doesn't mean to a bar mitzvah or to a wedding or to your in-laws. Go out mean as a couple, you went out to just bond, to connect, to spend time together. And her answer was, we didn't. I said, okay, how about the month before that? We didn't. The month before that? We didn't. The month before that? The month before that? I said, madam, don't you understand? It should be rather simple. The reason why you don't love your husband is because you're no longer bonding, you're no longer connecting. You're two ships that pass in the night, but there's nothing between you anymore. And the very first thing that a couple have to recognize is the love in the marriage is something you have to work on constantly. And it means on a regular basis going out. I say this all the time, and I always get the pushback. A couple should go out once a week, but once a week means leave the house. You get dressed up and you go out. It doesn't have to be the fanciest place in the city. It doesn't have to be the most exotic restaurant, but once a week you go out. But it's not just going out once a week. It's spending time together. It's connecting. It's bonding. It's the quality time that a couple spends together. It's the love notes and the little texts during the day, because, excuse my saying it in this manner, but this is the only way I know how to say it. A couple should be having an ongoing love affair throughout their marriage, but that love requires constant work, constant rejuvenating. But because I get the pushback so often, and I tell couples, you must go out, you have to go out. And I always get the reason why. I can't, how can we go out? Who could afford it? And a babysitter, who could afford it? How can we get a babysitter? And worse than that, my husband just started a new job. He's so busy. There's just no way we can go out. Okay, so it happens to be, because I've been in that position a number of times, I have an answer. Do you really think it's too expensive for you to go out once a week? Okay, what is the cost of alimony and a divorce lawyer? Do you really think you're too busy? What if you're running two households, single households? Are you going to have more time or less time? You think you can't find a babysitter? What about when you're a single mom or a single dad and you have to find someone to watch the kids? I guarantee it's a lot cheaper, a lot easier, and a whole lot more fun to go out once a week than it is to suffer the consequences. And if it sounds simplistic, I'm sorry to tell you, it is. That's simply what the reality is. If you're not connecting, if you're not bonding, if you're not building the love in a marriage, but we're married 5 years, we're married 10 years, we're married 20 years. Rabbi, that was Shana Rishona the first 2 years. But, once you catch the fish, you don't feed it worms, right? Well, I'd like to share with you, if you don't feed the fish worms, it's going to start stench. It's going to start smelling. And if you don't work on the love in your marriage, it's going to be very, very difficult. You guys are going to start separating. And it'll be 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is, and you'll be in different worlds. I've often had this conversation, and I've said to women, you have to go out, you have to spend 3 hours, you have to go out and talk, you bond. And I've had this more than once where a woman said to me, 3 hours? What would we talk about? Exactly. If you're that distant, you have to figure out how to reconnect. But that's the yesod. The first really dumb mistake that couples make is they assume infatuation is everything. And when the infatuation wears off, they assume they married the wrong one. Very, very mistaken. But the second really dumb mistake that couples make is they stop working on the love in the marriage. And when you stop working on the love in the marriage, you're going to separate, you're going to be distant, and it's going to be very difficult for you to be successfully married. A successful marriage has 3 pillars. Commitment. Commitment is based on knowing that Hashem chose the right one for me. The second pillar is love. You have to work on the relationship, on the love. You have to spend time as a couple. You have to do everything that lovers do, everything that you knew how to do when you were courting. You have to keep doing it through year 2, year 10, year 20, year 34, because it's an ongoing love affair. But here's the difficult part. Many couples really do love each other. Many couples really have a good connection and they really feel for each other. And despite the fact that they love each other, they can't live together. And that is the third pillar of a successful marriage. The first is commitment, knowing that Hashem chose the right one for me. That's going to give me the energy, the zeal to work on the marriage. The love is the glue. That's what requires all the work. That's where the focus is. But the third one, learning to live together, that pillar is a lot more tricky. And that's something that I'd like to spend a little time on now. And to do that, let me share with you a very interesting example. Okay, here's a story. A young couple, they're married not long at all, maybe about 6 months. And at 6:30 at night, he's coming home from work. He's about to go into his apartment. He takes out his keys. As he's about to open the door, he says to himself, wow, I did so well. I married such a grounded, sober girl, not one of those flighty dames, not one of those. And she's so put together and she's so intelligent. Ah, thank God. He opens the door and he walks into his apartment, and there he sees his wife on the chair. Dear, what is it? What is it? What? There. What? There. What is it? A cockroach, a cockroach. He looks at her. Hello? It's a cockroach. Please kill it. He walks over to the cockroach, takes his shoes, goes, and says, you can come down now. Okay, let's call that scene 1. Scene 2. 2 weeks later, he's at work, he's in a meeting, and because he's in a meeting, he has his phone on silent, and he doesn't hear his wife's calls. A coworker brings the phone to him and says, your wife has something to very, very, I don't know what the issue, but she's very, very excited. Maybe you should talk to her. He leaves the meeting, picks the phone. Dear, what, please, what? There are 2 of them. Please come home, please. I don't believe it. She wants me to leave work. She wants me to leave a meeting to kill 2 cockroaches. He leaves his office and gets in his car, drives home, there's steam coming out of his ears. He opens the apartment door and there she is on a chair. He walks over, scrunches 1, scrunches 2. He turns to her and says, I hope you're satisfied. He leaves the apartment, heads back to his car, goes back to work. Okay, here's the question. Who was right? Who was right? Was she right? After all, she was terrified. She was really scared, and that's why she called her husband. Was she right? Or was he right? After all, he's at work and he's very busy and to kill 2 stupid cockroaches. Was he right or her right? Who was right? The answer is the question is wrong. Who was right is a good question for a legal debate in a court of law, maybe in a divorce attorney's office. But who is right is probably the worst question that you could ever ask in a marriage. A much more valuable question to ask is what was going on in their inner world. And if we x-ray into the inner world, we may get a very, very different understanding. Now, I don't know why this is, but girls seem to be afraid of bugs. Boys seem not to be. I've 4 daughters, 2 sons. Anytime there was a bug when the girls were little, they'd call one of their brothers. And if it was a baby brother, they'd have to make sure he didn't eat it. But for some reason, boys were not afraid of bugs. Girls, I don't know why. But here's the point. To her, this is a terrifying experience. And to her, this is really frightening. To him, it's not. But that's very unfair because he's judging her based on his experience. In his world, bugs are not scary. Therefore, she's overreacting. But let's change the scenario a little bit. Let's assume it was him home in the apartment. And it wasn't 2 bugs, but it was 2 German shepherds. He would not be up on the chair. He'd be out the apartment, down the fire escape, running down the street because German shepherds are scary. Bugs aren't, dogs are. But you see, that's his experience. But his experience and her experience are vastly different. And if your experience defines reality, you're going to find it very difficult to be successfully married because your experience is your experience, but I guarantee it's not your spouse's. And because each of us experience things differently, each of us have different feelings, temperaments, emotions, and what she was feeling and what he was feeling was very, very different. And the mistake that both of them made was they judged each other based on their experience. She looked at him as a cold, callous creep. After all, bugs are terrifying. And why does a creep say those nasty words? I hope you're satisfied. It isn't bad enough I'm scared and he's so callous. He judged her based on his experience that she's overreacting. And both of them made one of the most pivotal mistakes in a marriage, judging your spouse based on your experience. But your experience doesn't define reality. That's your experience, but likely your spouse has a very different one. And I'd like to share with you now the 2 most important words in your marriage. If I were to ask you, what are the 2 most important words in your marriage? Now, usually I do this live and I ask people to write it down, and I get all kinds of interesting things like, yes, dear, I love you. First of all, I love you is 3 words. You're right. Even the worst one, the hardest one to say, I was wrong. That one, even that one, I believe are not the 2 most important words in your marriage. Would you like to know the 2 most important words in your marriage? Let me preface this by a certain observation. Every scientific discovery was preceded by an expression. Every scientific discovery was preceded by a certain expression that the person made, and most people think it's Eureka, I've discovered it. But it's not true. Almost every scientific discovery was preceded by the words, that's strange. A guy took chemical A, mixed with chemical B, and got, what? That's strange. Then he began digging in, and he discovered the underlying process, and he uncovered one of the great secrets. Almost every scientific discovery was preceded by the words, "That's strange," and then the curious, inquisitive studying of the elements to better understand what was going on. And I'd like to share with you the two most important words in your marriage are the words, "That's strange." When you see your spouse acting in a way that's really, really makes no sense, if you train yourself to say the words, "That's strange," you say it to yourself, not to your spouse. You train yourself to say, "That's strange," and then you might be able to climb into their inner world. You may be able to ask yourself, why would a sane, rational woman be up on a chair screaming? It makes no sense. That's strange. But if you say the words to yourself again, "That's strange," and then you begin that curious, inquisitive exploration of why would a sober, grounded young woman be up on the chair screaming? Then you begin climbing into the inner world. And if you have that curious, inquisitive approach, and when your spouse does something that's absolutely inexplicable, it makes no sense whatsoever, instead of doing what we always do, "Oh, that's him, he's a creep. That's her, she's flighty." If you say to yourself the words, "That's strange," let me understand. Why would my spouse react? He's normally such a good guy. He's normally so responsible. Why would he do this? Why would he spend money on that? I don't get it. Let me better understand. And if you begin the inquisitive process, and you begin climbing into their world, and you begin one of the most important steps in a successful marriage. Every fight in the marriage is based on that single difference. Not understanding the inner world of my spouse, not getting why she would react that way, why would he do this? And if you don't learn to climb into the inner world of your spouse, you're going to find it very difficult to be successfully married. And this is the first ingredient of learning to live together, learning a certain tolerance, learning that we're different, we have different temperaments, different natures, different styles, different approaches. And I don't care how similar you think you are. Every single couple, when they're going out, we do such things together. We're so alike. And then they get married and they discover they're so apart. They're so different. If you look on the inventory of personality traits, the Young Briggs inventory, you'll see that there are 16 different traits. Almost every single couple are vastly different in most of those areas. And that doesn't mean they can't have a very successful marriage. It means that all human beings are different. I'm different than you. You're different than him. Every person is different. And it's only when you're able to accept the fact that my spouse is different, and let me understand their experience, let me understand the world according to the way they feel, the way they view it, only then do you have a chance of living together. But because this third pillar, learning to live together, is so difficult, we need a formula. And I'd like to share with you a formula for doing this. The formula for love is very simple. You have to do exactly what you're doing when you're going out. The same way you courted, the same way you knew exactly what to say, the romantic lines, the compliments, the appreciative expressions. You do that continually. That's exactly how you keep the love in the marriage. But learning to live together is a lot more difficult, and we need a little formula to help us with that. And to do that, let me share with you something that the Rambam shares with us. He says a formula for a successful marriage. Says the Rambam, Sivu Chachamim, our sages commanded, for a man a role and for a woman a role. The Rambam says if the man will play his part properly, and if the woman will play her part properly, he says he guarantees they'll have a beautiful marriage, No'eh u'meshubach, beautiful, tranquil, peace and harmony. He has a role and she has a role. Let's look at his role. And says the Rambam, Adam mechabed es ishto yoseh megufo. He has to honor his wife more than he does himself. V'ohava kegufo, and he has to love her as he do himself. He has two jobs. He has to honor her more than he does himself, and he has to love her as he does himself. She also has a job. Her job, says the Rambam, she should honor her husband and treat him with exceeding amounts of respect, as if he's a prince, as if he's some honorable person. And if they will each do their part, guarantees the Rambam they'll have a beautiful marriage. He has his role and she has her role. He has to treat her with more honor than he treats himself, love her as he does himself. She has to treat him with exceeding amounts of honor. Okay, that's the Rambam. Now, let's ask the obvious question on the Rambam. I'm no mathematician, but the two sides are not equal. He has two jobs and she has one, right? He has to respect her, honor her more than himself, and he has to love her as himself. And she only has one job. She just has to treat him with exceeding amounts of respect. No, wait a minute. I thought love was the glue of marriage. I thought without love in the marriage is going to tank. Is she supposed to be in a loveless marriage? Why is the Rambam saying all she has to do is respect him? What happened to love on her side of the equation? And to answer this question, let me share with you an interesting observation. When my oldest daughter was in about 11th grade, it was a Friday night, and we were talking, and she said that two of her friends didn't come to school that day. I said, why not? She said, well, they were up late last night having a DMC. I said, a what? She said, a DMC. Now, I didn't know what a DMC was, but it sure didn't sound good. I said, what is a DMC? Oh, but come on, you know, a DMC, a deep, meaningful conversation. They're up all night sharing their life, what they're doing in their world. They're up so late that they were too tired. They didn't come to school the next day. Okay. At that point, I had been a high school Rebbe for boys for about 15 years. In my entire 15 years, not once did I see two guys spending hour after hour bonding, connecting, sharing their inner world in deep, meaningful not once in 15 years. Why is that? And why is that? Because women have a very different types of relationships and very different needs than most guys do. And women, as they're growing up, have very real friendships and very real bonds. Most guys have buddies. If you ask a 6-year-old girl to name her best friend, she'll tell you the name of her best friend. And if heaven forfend that best friend reveals their secret, then it's on to a new best friend. But girls have relationships, have friendships throughout their youth. As they grow up, they nurture them. Often they rate themselves. I remember I was about 20 years old, and I was in yeshiva in Rochester, and I approached the Rabbi Harris, who was the co-rosh yeshiva then. I said, you know, I have a lot of buddies in yeshiva, a lot of guys that I'm buddies with, slap each other on the back, play ball together, learn together, but I don't have a best friend. I feel I just don't have a best friend. And Rabbi Harris looked at me and said, who does? If you ask a woman who's her best friend, she'll tell you. She'll tell you, and if you ask her, when did you last speak to her best friend, she'll tell you it was either this morning or yesterday, and it was a long, meaningful conversation. Ask a guy, do you have a best friend? Of course I have a best friend. First of all, it's probably his wife. But even if he gets past his wife, do you have a best friend? Absolutely. When did you last speak to him? About 5 years ago. Why is that? Because typically women have much greater connections, much greater bonds, much greater need and ability to have friends, need friends, and manage those friendships. Now, one last observation. 90% of Shalom Bayis problems are solved if a woman knows one thing, if she knows that she's cherished. You see, at the core of her essence, a woman needs to know that she's loved. If you'd like to know in very simple language what I'm talking about, here's the following question. At what age does a woman begin thinking about her marriage? So I'm not a statistician over here, but I would say by about the age of 13. By about the age of 13, the average young woman has a very good understanding of what her marriage is going to look like, what it's going to be like. When does the average guy begin thinking about his marriage? About 5 years after the wedding. But why is that? Because the relationship typically is much more central to a woman's world, and much more important to her. It's something that she thrives on, something that she needs. She's had it since she's a child, and now she's getting married. It's going to be a best friend, but even better. And 90% of marriage problems are solved if a woman knows one thing. If she knows that she's cherished, if she knows that she's loved. Stipler, one of the great sages of 30, 40 years ago, wrote in an Igeris, he writes, the main hope of a woman in her world is to have a husband who loves her. When she sees that it isn't so, it crushes her spirit and can be close to pikuach nefesh, close to life-threatening. At the core of an essence, a woman needs to know that she's loved, and needs to know that she's cherished. And if a woman knows that, almost guaranteed they're going to have a beautiful marriage. Would you like to know why the Rambam didn't say to a woman, you have to love your husband? Because it naturally flows for her. It naturally comes out. As long as he does his part, she'll naturally love him. A woman doesn't need a command, a decree, guidance to love her husband. The man, on the other side, requires some work because it's not as instinctive, it's not as natural, and that is one of the key distinctions. One of the key things to the success of a marriage is a woman needs to know that she's cherished, that she's loved. If she knows that one single concept, she'll be happy. She'll feel fulfilled. And I'd like to share with you a very important observation. Most women, whether they're married a day, a week, a year, or longer, aren't secure in that understanding. And you know that little girl with the daisy, he loves me not, picking out the petals, he loves me not. I believe most women in the beginning of their marriage go through that stage, he loves me not. And when I say the beginning of the marriage, I mean the first 30 or 40 years. And if you think that I'm being facetious, I don't think so at all. And what a woman needs to be happily married is an understanding that she's number one in her husband's eyes. If she knows that she's cherished, she knows that she's appreciated, she knows that she's loved, she'll be happy, and the marriage will be beautiful. A happy wife is a happy life, but if not, you're in big, big trouble. And that is one of the most important things to recognize. But to make a happy wife, you have to realize what she needs, and you have to meet those needs. And if you're ready to say, oh, I get it, Rabbi, it's all the guy's fault. Haha, see, I get it. It's all those guys. I told you, they're the creeps, they're the problems. So I'd like to share with you that it's not so simple, because there are many things that women do that make it difficult for their husbands to like them, let alone love them. And let me share with you exactly what I mean. When the first Shmuz on a Parsha book came out, that's one of the books that I wrote, I asked my mother-in-law if she would do a final copy edit. You know, even though it had been well edited, but there are always little mistakes that fall into the text, a missing comma, a missing period. She has a very sharp eye, and even though she was working at the time, she very graciously agreed, and she did a great job. I was tempted to write in the acknowledgments, I'd like to thank my mother-in-law for correcting the manuscript, but there's nothing that gives a mother-in-law more joy than correcting a son-in-law, so I don't have to thank her. I didn't write it. Believe me, I didn't write it. But years later, my wife said that to her mother, and my mother-in-law said, oh, you shouldn't read it. That was cute. Okay, here's the point. Do you ever notice that mother-in-laws get a bad rap? They have a bad reputation. And why do mother-in-laws get a bad rap? Why is it? So I'd like to share with you the why. The woman brings home a fine young man, and the mother of the girl says, wow, a fine young man, so many good traits, so put together, wonderful. It's going to make a wonderful addition to our family. But even a good guy could use some improvement. So very shortly in the beginning, she begins trying to help him be even better. And what mother-in-laws do is become very unpopular. But why do they do that? The reason they do it is because a woman at her essence is a caregiver, a nurturer. She wants to help. She wants to improve. She wants to help her son-in-law be even better. And what happens very quickly is she becomes very unpopular. Now, my job over here is not to discuss being at peace with your mother-in-law. My job is a lot more basic to that. You see, I believe that every young woman, as she walks down that aisle, has a 10-point home improvement policy. And it's that guy under the chuppah who is going to be the recipient of those 10 points of improvement. And now she's well-behaved during the Sheva Bracha. She kind of waits, but shortly after the marriage, she begins her home improvement policy. And she says, you know, Chaim, your desk is a mess. It's such a mess. How do you find yourself in there? And he doesn't become all warm and fuzzy. So she says to herself, I don't know, maybe he didn't get it. So she makes the point even more clearly. Chaim, you know, you're gonna lose your desk in the mess of it. And he doesn't get all warm and fuzzy. And for some reason, he doesn't seem to warm up to her. But it's clear that she's only doing it because she loves him and she's concerned for him. And why is he being so obstinate? Why is he being such a creep, like a 2-year-old? What is his problem? So I'd like to share what his problem is. Men and women work very differently. If a woman sees her friend baking and she knows that there's a technique or a recipe that would help her, she feels obligated to help, because after all, if I could help her and I don't, I'm a creep. Why am I callous? Why wouldn't I help her? And when her friend receives the help, her friend is very, very happy to receive the help. Try going over to a guy changing a tire and say, hey, buddy, you know, if you hold the wrench this way, it'll be easier. You're asking for a fist fight. Why? Because men do not appreciate unsolicited advice. When you say to a guy, you could do it better, what you're saying is, I know better than you. You see, men by nature are very competitive Men by nature rank themselves, and men by nature do not like other people telling them what to do, when to do, how to do it. And if you think that this is a minor point, I don't think so at all. I get this all the time. They're married 20 years. They're in their 40s. And she screams, "Oh, you pick up your socks. Moshe, what's wrong with you? I told you 10,000 times to pick up your socks. Why don't you do it?" Stop. And they come to me with the problem. He won't pick up his socks. Okay. Now, he's 45 years of age. Should he pick up the socks? Oh, yes, he should. There's no question that he should. But yet, after 20 years of marriage, he still has not picked up his socks. And that's when I share with the woman the great secret of learning to live with another human being. You would pick up your socks. You feel it's important to pick up your socks. And I agree with you. He should pick up his socks. But guess what? For whatever which reason, it's not so easy for him. He's different than you. And unless you embrace your spouse, you're going to suffer. But Rabbi, he's a slob. You're 100% right. But who's going to teach him? Not you, because he'll never change. And I usually give the following example because women don't really get this. So I say to them the following. I was at a Shabbaton. It was a Shalom Bayit Shabbaton, a marriage Shabbaton, and I was speaking. And a certain fellow came over to me after. He was a physician. And he said, "Rabbi, you have to help me. My wife, she put on 40 pounds. She had the first kid. She put on some weight. Second kid, some weight. Third kid. And I offered her everything. I offered her a nutritionist. I offered her to work out. A private exercise coach. But she just won't do it. Rabbi, you have to help me." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Listen, I'm a doctor. I work in the hospital. The young nurses are all slim, and it really bothers me. How could you help me?" I said, "Young man, you have a choice to make. You see, if your wife is 40 pounds overweight, I do not know of a woman alive who looks in the mirror and says, 'Wow, 40 pounds overweight. That's great. I'm so happy.' For whatever which reason right now, it's not going to happen. She's too much on her plate. The kids, that stress, whatever, it's not going to happen. You have a choice to make. You either embrace her as she is or you suffer. Because for whatever which reason she should, but she's not gonna. And you either embrace her as she is now or you suffer. And when I say this to spouses, and it's not just women, it's not just men, it's both, understanding that I'm different than my spouse and understanding that my spouse has a flaw and understanding that, yes, they really should do things differently. But despite that fact, they're not. And guess what? Maybe it's because for right now, for them, they're not going to change. For me, it's easy. Why don't they just be like me? Because they're not you. Now, and by the way, I want to share with you one very important observation. I was speaking in Chicago, it was now maybe 3 years ago. And again, it was on this topic. I do speak about many other topics, but it happens to be speaking about marriage. And a woman raises her hand and says, "Rabbi Shafier, do you remember you were here 2 years ago in Chicago and you're speaking about marriage?" I said, "I remember being here, yeah." She said, "Do you remember what you said?" I said, "No, I don't." She said, "Well, you told that story about the socks on the floor, and I have to tell you, it changed my marriage." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, my husband, Sunday night, he would take off his jacket, leave it on his chair. Monday night, he'd wear a different suit, take off that jacket, leave it on a second chair. Tuesday night, by Thursday night, his entire wardrobe was in the dining room." I said, "What used to happen?" She said, "I used to scream, I used to yell." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Well, now Sunday night, he puts the jacket on a chair. I take it up and I hang it in his bedroom." I said, "How's your shalom bayis? How's your marriage now?" "It's beautiful." I made those women stand up and clap because that was exactly the point. Now, shouldn't he put his jacket on the hanger? Isn't that what a man should do? Yes, absolutely. I agree. You agree. But for whatever which reason, it's not going to be. But that means he's flawed. You better believe it. He's flawed, just like you and I. You and I have flaws, and so does your spouse. And learning to accept that is one of the keys to successful marriage. I believe, as Rashi shares with us, a fundamental concept. When Hashem changed the words, it was because Hashem did not want Avram to be even on the slightest level a scratch, a mar, because the glue of the marriage, that which holds it together, is the love. The reason why the angels said to Avram, "Where is Sarah your wife?" was because they wanted her to be more beloved, because there was more that could be added, because the essence of a successful marriage is a love. Commitment comes from knowing that Hashem chose the right one for me. Love in the marriage requires an awful lot of work, the going out, the dating, and the love notes, the cards, everything that lovers are supposed to do. But you have to do it actively, not as infatuation happens instantly. Love requires real work. You want to see real love, look at an older couple. in their 70s, in their 80s. You see a bond, you see a connection, but that requires constant work, constant invigorating, and it requires a lot of time. But it's the third pillar of a successful marriage, learning to live together, that is the most difficult. The first concept is understanding that my experience is my experience. My experience doesn't define reality. That young man, when he came home and saw his wife on the chair, he judged her based on his experience. In his world, bugs are not scary, but guess what? In hers, they are. And saying to yourself the words, that's strange, when your spouse does something that's inexplicable, will allow you to then take on that curious, scientific, inquisitive state of studying the inner world of your spouse, learning to understand them, and then you have to come to the most difficult part. You have to embrace your spouse as they are. But I'm going to change him. No, you're not. But I have to change him. You're not going to do it. But if I don't change him, who's going to change him? You're not going to change him. No matter how hard you try, no matter how hard you work on it, you're not going to change him because he is flawed. But I'm living with a flawed husband? Yes, you are. As he's flawed, you're flawed, we're all flawed. How do I know that? Because God put us into this world to grow and accomplish. If I were perfect, I'd be done my job here and it'd be time to leave this earth. I sure hope you still have flaws, because that means you still have work to do and you still have time to be here. But it's very easy to look at your spouse's flaws and say, he should change, she should change. It's a lot more difficult to look inwardly. But I believe that's exactly the concept. Understanding Hashem chose the right one for me, working on the love, and then finally working on the last part, the learning to live together. Between these three, that's exactly what a marriage needs. And Hashem helps, and you live a beautiful marriage together. Now, Rabbi Simon, maybe I went over time, but I want to take some questions. So if we could open the floor to questions, thoughts, observations. And first of all, before we do, while everybody's kind of taking their mic off of mute, I just want to mention that the Kesher sponsored copies of the 10 really dumb mistakes that very smart couples make. Please contact Rabbi Simon, and he'll explain to you how you get the copy. You may have to actually come out of your home. I know here in America, we're COVID's, I don't want to say over, but we're largely going about business life as normal. I know you guys are still dealing with this. So, but at some point when you come out, you can get a copy. Rabbi Simon has copies of them, and the Kesher sponsored them. So please ask him for a copy of the 10. This is the pre-publication copy, by the way. It won't be in the stores until maybe October time, but this is the pre-publication copies. So they have them in the synagogue in Kesher. And now we can open the floor to questions. Please feel free to ask. You could raise your hand, and I believe Mrs. Simon is going to be the moderate.
Just before we do that, I want to thank Rabbi Shafier very much for a captivating presentation. I think we only got to the first two of the 10 mistakes. It gives you a reason to come collect the book from Kesher, or if you don't get there in time, you can always buy it from Amazon when it is available, and it's well worth your while to read it. I'm sure that, well, that wasn't exactly the function of this year. It has been a most compelling advertisement for the book. But that's not the point. That's just by the by. The fact that he wrote the book is just derech agav. Thank you very much, Rabbi Shafier.